Hi guys, welcome back to the My Cupcake Addiction Kitchen. In today's episode, we're going to be making this amazing Snickers bar inspired giant cupcake. It's got a gooey caramel center, it's covered in Snickers, one of my favorite chocolate bars, and it's absolutely perfect for so many different occasions. Let's get started. To make your delicious Snickers giant cupcake, you'll need some of our caramel frosting. I just released this recipe a couple of days ago and I'll leave a link to it in the description box below. I've also got some crushed nuts, some Snickers bars. Now I've chopped my Snickers into kind of larger chunks and then finer chunks. I've got some melted dark chocolate. I've got a long serrated edge knife or a bread knife, a spoon. I've got a pair of scissors and a Ziploc bag as well as a circle cutter. I'm using a spatula and then an offset spatula. And over here I've got kind of a cheat for my caramel. I'm using a can of caramel top and fill. You can make your own caramel or you can boil condensed milk, but you will need some kind of caramel for this. I've got my baked giant chocolate cupcake ready to go, as well as a giant chocolate cupcake case. If you haven't made a giant cupcake with us before, I will leave links to our giant cupcake basics series in the description box below. Off to the side, I've also got just a square cake board, and I've got that on a cake decorating turntable for ease. I'm also going to be using just a hand blender today, but you can also use a whisk for this if you don't have an electric mixer. So the first thing you want to do is you want to prepare your caramel filling. Like I said, I'm just using some of this canned caramel because it's super easy. I'm just going to scoop it into a bowl, and because canned caramel can sometimes not be as fluid, I'm going to use my electric mixer to mix it all together so there's no lumps or chunks. Then I'm going to take all of those beautiful nuts and I'm going to add those in because we know Snickers is packed full of nuts and packed full of caramel. So you can have the chocolate on the outside, the chocolate cupcake, and the caramel and nut filling. Stir that all the way through and your filling is prepared. Now we're going to trim, stack and fill your giant cupcake. So I always cut off the outer edges of my cupcake because we're using a giant chocolate cupcake case made in the same mold. You actually need to create a little bit of room in between your baked giant cupcake and that chocolate giant cupcake case. Once you've chopped off all of your sides, and it's about 1/2 centimeter all the way around, you want to just trim the top of your giant cupcake so that you don't have a domed, cracked top at all. It's as flat as you can get it. And then we're going to slice that giant cupcake base directly in half so that you've got two relatively even pieces. Take your circle cutter now and you want to sort of twist it in, but you don't want to cut all the way through the base. So I'm just going to use my knife to kind of lift out that little wedge, but I've still got cake at the very bottom, so I'm not going to have caramel oozing out the base of my cupcake. You want to also cut out a nice little circle core in the top half of the base of your cupcake, but don't go all the way through. You can see I'm using the knife once again just to kind of go around that guide circle so I don't crack the top. The size of your circle cutter is up to you depending on how much gooey caramel you want, but I will leave dimensions for mine in the description box below. Now you want to take the top, so the cone top of your giant cupcake, and I'm just going to carve off the very bottom so that it's nice and flat. It's going to rest flat on top of our giant cupcake base. With all of your cupcake pieces prepared, it's time to start stacking. So I always stick my chocolate case back into that clean, dry silicone mold just to give it extra support. And then I'm just going to scoop some of that caramel frosting into and all the way up the sides of that chocolate cupcake case using my little spatula. This is just so that your cake's got something to stick to, and when you cut it, the chocolate shell actually sticks to the sides of the cake instead of falling off and coming apart. So once I've got just a nice thin coating, I'm going to take the bottom section of my giant cupcake base and I'm just going to drop it in. Push that down using your fingers so it's nice and firm in the bottom of that case. And then you want to take your spoon and some of that filling, and we're just going to spoon a tablespoon or two of filling into that well in the center of your giant cupcake base. Don't go around the edges just yet. You want to take your spatula and we're just going to spatula on some of that frosting. Once again, not too much here. So I'm going to use my spoon just to spread it out, trying not to go over the top of that central filling. Once you've got your frosting all nice and spread out, I actually like to take another couple of tablespoons of that delicious caramel and nut mixture and spoon it on top before adding on the next layer of your giant cupcake base. You want to repeat this process pretty much exactly. So some more of that gooey caramel nut filling in the center hole of your cupcake, and then some more of the caramel frosting and a little bit more of that caramel nut filling on top. But make sure that this lot of your caramel nut filling doesn't go too far out over the edges because you don't want it dripping down the sides of that giant cupcake case. So you can see I'm leaving about 1 inch or so around the entire edge of my cupcake. Take your giant cupcake top now and you just want to sit it on top, but you are going to have a little bit of a gap in between the base and the top. These never meet up absolutely perfectly. To start off with, you want to take your offset spatula, and I'm just going to do like a really light crumb coat, so just a really thin coating, not too much of that caramel frosting, all over the top of that dome. Now, because I know that I've got that gap and I want as much Snickers as I can jam into this giant Snickers cupcake, I'm going to take some of those smaller chunks of Snickers and I'm just going to shove them all the way in around the edges, right in between the cupcake top and the cupcake base. Using the offset spatula again, I'm kind of just going to seal those in with a little bit more frosting. So let's get decorating. Now, you've got your crumb coat down and I just like to add just another little coating of frosting, not too much here. If you put on too much frosting at this point, the weight of all of your Snickers is going to slide off. So I'm just using my offset spatula to apply just under a centimetre or so of additional frosting on top of that basic crumb coat. If you do have a particularly crummy top to your giant cupcake, if it's broken or if it's come out of your giant cupcake mold not so well, you can put that in the freezer for 10 minutes or so just to allow that crumb coat to completely set before applying this second coat of frosting. With my frosting all on, I'm going to take some more of that gooey caramel nut mixture and I'm kind of just going to loosely kind of glob some on top. This is going to give us a bit more colour and also a bit more caramel, because in a Snickers cupcake, like I said, there can never ever be too much caramel. I'm resting mine on my turntable at this point just so that it's a little bit easier for me to get around all the edges, but I like to start with adding on some of those larger chunks of Snickers and then filling in the gaps with the smaller. So this is why we've cut them in two different sizes. If you only had large chunks, you wouldn't be able to fill in all those little gaps, and if you only had small chunks, you wouldn't get that kind of really rough, rustic look that we're looking for. So I'm just going to go around the cupcake and, like I said, position a few large ones, fill in the gaps with a few small ones. When it comes to the edges of your cupcake, where the cupcake meets up with that chocolate base, try to only use the smaller chunks of Snickers because you don't want the weight of the larger chunks to pull down on that frosting. Once your cupcake is completely coated in all of that delicious Snickers, pop it in the freezer for about 20 minutes or so to let all that frosting and Snickers completely set. Once it comes out of the freezer, you want to take your melted dark chocolate, and you can also use milk chocolate here, pour it into a Ziploc bag. We're just going to cut a nice generous tip off the end of the Ziploc bag. There's no exact measure. We're going to use the Ziploc bag to kind of really roughly splatter the entire top of the cupcake with melted chocolate. This is going to A, hold all of your little pieces of Snickers together, and B, add more chocolate and a little bit more detail to the top. You'll notice I've still got my giant cupcake resting in that silicone mold at this point to keep our base nice and neat. Once your chocolate's set, you want to carefully roll down the sides of your silicone cupcake case, and we're doing this carefully so that we don't get any frosting on the outside edges of the cupcake case that we've worked so hard to keep clean. You want to take just a teaspoon and add a little bit more of that melted chocolate, milk or dark, onto your cake board or your plate or whatever you're serving your cupcake on, and then just lift it straight out of that case. Position your best side forward and use that chocolate to glue it down to the cake board for extra stability. Now, I chose to finish mine off with a little happy birthday kind of Snickers logo. I will leave a link to that template in the description box below, and I've also created a happy Father's Day one because we are coming up to Father's Day, and I don't know about you, but my dad would love this cupcake. I also used a nice brown ribbon just to give a bit of extra detail. I hope you guys have enjoyed this giant Snickers candy-inspired cupcake. If you've got a favourite candy bar you'd like to see in giant cupcake form, let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks very much for tuning in to My Cupcake Addiction.